yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. May God add a blessing to the reading of his holy word. The last couple of decades, one of the trendy things that businesses have done is the incorporation of core values. Maybe some of you have worked places where they have done so, that when people meet together, an organization attempts to the best of their ability to articulate what is most important to them, how to best express those ideas, how to maintain everyone's clear focus about what it is that they are to be doing as an organization. It's also become somewhat more in vogue in the last few years for individuals to come up with core values for them. And among those that people often suggest to ask yourself questions to determine what is truly a core value for you. Some of those questions that I found online might include, if you knew that tomorrow was your last day of this life, what would you do on that day? At the end of your life, what would you want to look back on and say that you have achieved? If there were a list of adjectives that were to describe you, what would you want to be on that list? If you were to die tomorrow, what is the one thing you hope people would remember about you? What have you invested most of your time in? Is there anything that you consider worthy of dying for? If you were to write a letter to your children, what would you say in it? Those are some pretty deep and important questions for us to maybe ponder sometimes, to consider what are the things that are most important to us. And on the surface, that is a great idea to write them down. Now, if your experience echoes mine, which hopefully it doesn't, when you get together and actually do this as an organization or as a group, sometimes the ideal doesn't always meet the practice, because as human beings, we tend to mess stuff up. We tend to spend a lot of time arguing about a word choice or a punctuation point, and then everyone's finally happy with some statements, and then they put it in a filing cabinet and forget about it until someone says, hey, didn't we write down some core values a couple years ago? We better look that up. Because as human beings, we often kind of make some mistakes. We make errors and forget about things. But God never does. He would never forget what is core to him. Wouldn't it be great if at any point in the Bible Jesus said, you know what's really important? Do you know what's really core to me? Maybe I'll just tell you. Well, in our passage today, that's kind of what Jesus does. Someone asked him, what is the greatest, what is the most important thing to remember? If you're only going to remember this, what would it be? And he told them to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God and love people. Love God and love people. So the first of those that Jesus talks about are core to him is to love God. Now, our story starts here when we have the Pharisees. They were the ruling class, the religious leaders, those who often tried to justify themselves by their own righteousness, by their actions and behaviors, that they were good. And so, Jesus often made them angry. They had just seen earlier that the group called the Sadducees, another religious and ruling group of people, had attempted to, as they had so often done, trick Jesus. And as it was so often the case, they were unsuccessful in doing so. But the Pharisees were not deterred. They decided that they would do something different. And so they found among their ranks a lawyer, which is different in our modern usage of the word lawyer. Not someone that usually argues in the court of law, but one who studies and knows the law, both the rabbinical and the religious law. And so, probably one of the most learned and educated among them to come up with a question that they, in their attempt, hoped that they could use to trick Jesus into saying something where they could accuse him of doing something wrong. Something that they could use against him or undermine him. because they asked him that question. What is the most important commandment? Now, this was somewhat of a common practice among the Pharisees, who saw the use of such rhetoric as an important means of discussion to open up dialogue between them, that they would argue with one another about whether this is more important or this is more important. They would sit in debate, often attempting to use wisdom and wit to gain accolades and acceptance in their group and to maybe move up their own social ranks. Rarely did they ever actually use it to discuss or discover some great life-changing truth, but rather used philosophy as just a means of debate and entertainment. Some things don't change. I'm sure that sometimes in our own lives where we've met people like that as well, always looking for intellectual approval and acceptance, much more than truth. Now, they would have well known that in their laws in Judaism, they were considered 613 laws, of which we would say that 284 are positive, or saying that God was asking us to do something. 365 of which were negative, or us saying that God was asking us not to do something. Then, of course, they further subdivided these into many other characters, assessing which ones were more important, which ones were less important, and how that was to be followed out and what it would look like in daily practice. And so the Pharisees came with this question, and they would have certainly pre-thought or presupposed that Jesus would have mentioned something about Moses, because even though the Sadducees only considered the first 5 books of the Bible authoritative, those written by Moses. Now, the Pharisees considered all the Old Testament authoritative, but they definitely considered the books of Moses to be most important. So certainly, Jesus would have chose something from what Moses said, because Moses was the most important person. After all, he was the one who received the 10 Commandments from God. God wrote on the tablets who he delivered, that he delivered the people out, that he brought them into the promised land. So surely they were expecting something along those lines. And so, in fact, Jesus does, in some ways, quote Moses, or refer back to them. He's referring to the passage of Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning with verse 4, which to Jews at the time, or even today, they sometimes refer to as the Shema, which starts with, "Hear, O Israel." The entire passage reads, "The Lord our God, the Lord alone, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." And at the time of Jesus, it would have definitely been the most quoted passage in the entire Old Testament. In fact, very Orthodox Jewish people, certainly the Pharisees, would have repeated it at least twice every day. And so Jesus was reminding them about its importance, something that they would have already been aware of in terms of their intellectual knowledge of the command. Well, when Jesus talks about it, he uses a verb, and the verb tense that he uses is a futuristic term, which means, of course, that it's yet to happen. It's something that's going to happen in the future, to love God. But it is also, at the same time, an imperative or a command, which implies that it is something that must happen. It must occur. That we must love God, that extends in our experience into the future. If we are going to serve God, it is something that starts now, continues onward. That we love God with all of who we are. Not just a portion, but all of who we are. That is what is most important. For that is the type of love that God extends to each one of us. He doesn't just love us a little bit. He loves us solely and totally. And so when he talks about these different aspects, to love with the heart and the soul, the heart we refer to as the seat of our emotions, and the soul, the center of our personality, our mind, where we reason. And so the totality of who we are is under the authority of God. The uniqueness, the unity of God, that he is the one who is able to care for us. So Jesus tells them, of course, something they would have been familiar with. This is the first and the greatest commandment. There is nothing more important than this. But Jesus' application, or implicitly, as he tells more that, and even in the parts that we didn't read today, is that these things are not something just to be said, or something to be known in our intellectual mind, or something to write down on a piece of paper and put in a filing cabinet. that they are the way in which people who love God follow God, the way that they act, the way that they live, that God is always the top priority for them. I'm reminded of the words of Bill Bright, who some of you might know founded Campus Crusade Christ. And he one time said that my life's message is that I am a slave of Jesus. All that involves to love, to trust, and to obey. Now, of course, I am a son of God, an heir of Jesus, a joint heir with Jesus Christ. But even Paul and Peter, the other apostles, describe themselves as slaves. And to me, that is the highest privilege that a person could know. That everything I do in my life, every move I make, whether it is day or light, is to fulfill God's will. Our number one priority. The number one thing is that our lives fall under the dominion and authority of God. Deuteronomy 10 reminds us, and now, O Israel, what does the Lord require of you? He requires only that you fear the Lord your God and live in a way that pleases him. God needs all of us. The totality of us. Our time, our focus, our talents, our energies. The best way then to show that is to live. Following the love of God, to allow that love into us and to flow out of us. Jesus tells us in the New Testament in John 14:15 that if you love me, you obey my commandments. If you love Jesus, then you do what he says. Don't say you love Jesus and then don't do what he says, because your actions prove that you don't. If you say, to your spouse, I love you, and then you go out and you punch them and have an affair and do other things, that's not showing love to them. Your actions bear witness to what you say is true. So Jesus is reminding the Pharisees and all those and seeing that our lives are about a commitment and sacrifice. That there's always going to be tension in our lives between the things sometimes that the world pulls us to, our own selfish desires or our own interests pull us towards. 1 John 2:15 says, do not love the world or the things that the world offers you, for if you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father. See, how can you love God and at the same time love the things that are fighting against God, that are contrary to God? One of those two things can't be simultaneously in this moment completely true. Either we're pursuing what God's will is or pursuing some other path outside of God's will. Because the reality is that God doesn't accept being second place. He doesn't want equal billing. He's got to have his name first on the marquee. He's kind of a jealous God in some ways. As he said in the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God. There is to be no other gods before me. If we truly love God and we place him first. So, Jesus has adequately answered the lawyer's questions. Except then that Jesus gives sort of a bonus answer, but not just for extra credit. He's tying these two concepts together, even though that the original question only asked for one commandment. But he immediately ties the two things together by telling them that you must love your neighbor as yourself, by saying, if you love God, the natural outpouring of loving God is to love your neighbor. The two things go hand in hand. If you love God and you love the people that God made, that he wants people to be genuinely intentional and active and personal in their relationships. Not a love that's just emotional or reactionary or heartfelt, although those are components of love, but it's a love that requires action and doing something. Think about, when it says as you love yourself, how do we love ourselves? Well, when I get hungry, I usually get something to eat eventually, or probably too often. If I'm thirsty, I get something to drink. When I'm tired, I sleep. You take care of yourself, right? You try to do the things that, as you have needs, you meet those needs. Well, Jesus is saying that as you love yourself, as you meet those basic needs that you have, What can you do that if you see others who have basic needs? How can you address those needs? And that same thing should be applied to them. If you're going to love God and care about your needs, of which God supplies, care about the needs of those who are around you. That's not my opinion. That's what Jesus says. That's exactly what he says. And he even adds on that the entirety of the law and the prophets hinges on this. The law and the prophets were at the time usually a reference to the entire Old Testament. Pretty much everything was divided in Judaism between those things that were law and those things that were the prophets. Sometimes in our modern idea, we break up the Old Testament into bigger groups, but they only had two major groups to break it into. So he's saying all of the scriptures hinge on these two things. In the same way that a door has hinges. I mean, we can look at a door and see its hinges. Without the hinges, the door falls off. But it allows everything else to swing on it. There's a whole bunch more door there, and the door's necessary. But if you don't have hinges, it's just going to fall off. If you don't have love of God, and you don't have love of people, everything else is going to fall away. It's not going to stay together. C.S. Lewis wrote in his fabulous work, Mere Christianity, don't waste your time bothering to ask whether you actually love your neighbor. Act as if you did. For this is one of the great secrets. When you behave as if you love someone, you actually come to like them more. That's the truth. Our actions often lead to how we feel about someone. Sometimes we sit back, do I like this person? Do I love them? Do I want to do this? And we debate all these intellectual different things and stuff. But if we just demonstrate love, then the love of God comes through us and we actually feel more of that love. You know, if you think back in your life, I'm sure there are times when you look back and you think, my goodness, I've probably ticked God off pretty good a couple of times. I've probably given him reason to get some pretty angry at me. I've given him reasons not to demonstrate love. Yeah, we probably all have. But did God stop loving us? Did he stop demonstrating love? Of course not. It's impossible to who God is. God is love, and it flows to us. And so when we receive that love, our job isn't to just collect it all in a basket and wait till harvest time. It's to demonstrate and allow that love to flow out of us to reach the people who are around us. Even though we didn't deserve it, God never turned his back on us. You know, 1 John 4:7 reminds us, dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God. But anyone who doesn't love does not know God, because God is love. You can't say that you're going to turn your back on everyone else and say, I love God. Because John's saying, no. If you love God, then that love is evident in your life and how you treat other people. That's what he's asking us to do. That it requires us to actually do something. As James tells us in chapter 2, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye, have a good day, stay warm and well fed. What good has that done? True faith, true love, requires us to act. And look at the passage that Shelby read in our Bible lesson today, taken from Luke. A similar question, when a teacher of the law, they come and they want to trick Jesus, and they ask him that question about who is their neighbor. Now, it was a common teaching in Judaism at that time that your neighbor are the people that are like you. Fellow Jewish people were often, many rabbis taught, were your neighbor. So the people that look like you, had the same life experience as you. Those are the people that you have to worry about taking care of. But Jesus, as he so often does, greatly expands the definition of neighbor. And so we have this story of this man who was beaten, abused in many ways, and we have two people who are obviously well-trained or versed in the religious law. a priest and a Levite. A Levite was someone who, a priest had to come from the line of Levite, and so they had a role within the worship of God. And so both of these men, whether they had agendas, whether they were afraid that they were going to get involved, they would be harmed, hurt, they had places to go, we don't know, but they continued on with what they were doing. But then a Samaritan, who the Jews hated, the Jewish people at this time. They were considered half-breeds. They were considered turning their back on their true heritage of who they were, and there was a lot of disdain for them. So to the first hearers, this would have been absolutely shocking that this individual would be the one to stop. And yet it is the one that is least expected that stopped and did something. And see, Jesus asked the question, which one of these acted as a neighbor? Is it the ones who have some sort of title, who have some sort of training, who we've put some sort of label on? Or is it the person who stops and does and is obedient to what Jesus is teaching? He clearly answers, it was the last one. Our love requires us to act. He started a little bit by talking about core values. And what I see Jesus saying here is, what's core to me? What do I think is really important that everything else is going to flow out of? That stuff's all really important, so I'm not saying forget everything else. But if you cut back to it, it's about loving God and loving the people that God made so that they too can find and love God. Jesus even tells us in Matthew chapter 5, if you love only those who love you, what reward is that? Even tax collectors do that much. If you're kind to only your friends, how are you different than anyone else? Even pagans do that. See, if you follow Christ, if you say, I'm a Christian, which is the means to follow Christ, that I have Christ in me, that I want to emulate and do the things that he did, and then we're called to be different. See, the rest of the world, people that are nice to you, easy to be nice to them. Be nice to people that are your friends, easy to do. Everyone does that. But to be a Christian, to be a follower of Christ, is to follow the actions that Christ did by loving even those who aren't your friends, even those who don't love you. Because God, as he so often does, calls us to a higher standard. And so he asks us to examine ourselves today. Do we truly love God? Is he the top priority? Or are there other things that when we think about where would I give my time, talent, abilities, where do I think about, my thoughts, and what do I give all of who I am to? Is it God? Is it following Christ, or is it something else? And if it's something else, then we kind of made an idol out of that. And we need to re-examine ourselves and ask God to see, can you be top priority again? I want you to be the most important thing in my life. I want to feel your love, who you are, and so that your love inspires me, motivates me to extend that love to everyone that I meet, that I may treat them as a neighbor, that I may treat them in the same way that you have treated me. Because the entirety of what Jesus is saying, the Old Testament, the Scripture, all the things that he's saying that we need to study and know, often comes back to those core values of loving God and loving people. And those are the things that as Christians, as followers of Christ, we must do. Let us pray. God, thank you for loving us. Thank you for loving us even when we've been stupid and foolish, rebellious and arrogant. God, I just ask that we may mirror the same love that you have given to us, that we may mirror it back to you, and that we may mirror it to our fellow human beings. That we would be vessels of your love that will continue to flow through and around us, that we may be true followers of our only Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. At this time,